It was Ruth Salo, the Gibson branch librarian, speaking to Gary, and again she was instrumental in vectoring a perceived interest of his, directing it in a positive direction. Earlier having introduced him to the Chowder Observatory, and his visual transportation experience to the planet Saturn, via the telescope. This time approaching him with an opportunity to explore another out-of-this-world realm. Her husband Edward, a physicist at the University of California Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, known as the Rad Lab. The teen was aware of Mrs. Salo's husband's eminent occupation. His only youthful contact with the elder Salo was the unforgettable Chowder Observatory excursion. The librarian presented the specifics and the question. The invitation was for Gary to accompany her and Edward to a private library in Berkeley, to assemble with an enlightened group of professionals, whose engrossment was the genre of science fiction. The like-minded group, meeting on a regular basis on Telegraph Avenue. The cadre of those in attendance included applauded authors such as Philip K. Dick, Raj Phillips, Poul Anderson, his wife Karen, and fantasy and science fiction magazine editor Tony Bocher. Gary, having thrived on the literary conceptions of Robert A. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and long list of SF authors, having discovered Poul Anderson years earlier. To experience a celebrated association of such distinction was incomprehensible to the 15-year-old. His answer to the question was a resounding yes. He would very much like to attend. Their Berkeley destination was the Garden Library in the 2500 block of Telegraph Avenue. Once arriving, Gary, discovering he was the youngest in attendance, and was somewhat ill at ease among this elderly group. The gathering possessing an organizational name: Elves, Gnomes, and Little Men's Science Fiction, Chowder and Marching Society. The sobriquet displaying a knowledgeable wonderment, furthering Gary's conjectured about the group. The youth seated among this celebrated faction, the Salos introducing him to those celebrated appropriators of inventive science. A sense of ambiguity soon faded, as the guest speaker arose, a noted physicist, standing before a chalkboard, clearing his throat, beginning a discourse on a topic of interest to those in attendance: the yet-to-be-explored world of hyperspace. The hypothesis of the lecturer's address resonated with the group, and questions from the assembly abounded, espousing a diversity of ideas from those attending. Gary was astounded by the discussions, but concluded that the futuristic resources found in the novels were an exponent of these and other carbon meeting. The young man, acknowledging his noesis was probably lesser than the attendees, but was vehement in his attention, and about being present. It was the meeting after the meeting, the teen sitting in the back seat of the car, expecting a return home. But instead noticing the transport traveling north to the vicinity of Shattuck Avenue, the vehicle coming to rest at a night spot. It was late, and upon entering, finding the atmosphere of the dining and drinking enterprise vacant of all but a few patrons. Once seated, the conversation wasn't as Gary expected. There were 7 people seated at the table: Poul and Karen Anderson, the Silos, himself, and another couple whose name had slipped by. Anticipating a discussion of allegory science, or subliminal encounters of another world, subject matter that interested a 15-year-old, but instead, the conversation was a political discourse of whether or not President Eisenhower would seek a second term. The disappointment of the conversation, or lack of it, was overshadowed by just being in the presence of the Andersons. Their presence instilling the young observer with a glowing presentiment of sufficiency, the couple living a life in a world of their own conceptions. Gary, realizing he could attempt to relate this analogous moment of his life to friends, but it would be ineffable to them. When the Salos asked the inevitable question about his experience that night, and if he was interested in continuing to attend, his answer was a resounding yes, and would desire to become a regular guest or member. Little did they realize what revivals inside, and what was unsaid, the inner feeling of satisfaction that comes with associating with such a celebrated group, Gary concluding that fame and humility can be compatible.